Everyone's like, oh, look, here comes Pensy Joe bringing the Pennsylvania stuff because really test LED in the headlight, but we'll take this
known quite well by all. Regular combination, she's all that
Sheet at 10. Proceed to 15. Hey everybody, this is Pensy Joe back again for another Train Talks video. And today I'm going to be talking about the history of the Pennsylvania and Atlantic Railroad. Yes, finally this video has come. So, how we're going to start this video? Well, let's go all the way back into 1945, at the end of World War II in December of 1945. Now, in December 1945, a special day has happened. First off, the Pennsylvania has received its first T1 duplex locomotives right off the assembly line and have been delivered to, I'm not sure where exactly, but they've been delivered to the company. On the same day, the first EMD E7s have arrived for their first day of service as well. This is a pivotal moment in the Pennsylvania Railroad's history, and one that will set a shockwave for the rest of its history. Steam is coming to an end soon. Alrighty. So since the Pennsylvania started doing diesel operations in 1945 at the end of the year, the Pennsylvania Railroad executives had to come with a new course of business. So, since diesels are technically cheaper than steam locomotives to be maintained and in operation, the company had to make a big decision. They realized that since there's a new technology that's coming out that allows for saving money in operations and needing less crew people to run the locomotives, the Pennsylvania decided, you know what? Let's see if there's anywhere else we can start cutting down costs and innovation. And just like around the 1960s, a little bit later into the 50s, the New York Central Railroad was figuring these things out as well. And not only that, in the 1940s, mid-1940s, late 1940s, they were rapidly changing to dieselization with their new president in charge at the time. So the Pennsylvania had to decide two things. One, are they going to still hold up steam until the very end? Two, is this whole railroad's history of being a conservative company going to change? Or are they going to be on the same path, like in real life, to their doom when they got merged to Penn Central later on down the road? Well, in this universe, corporate executives did change the direction of what the railroad was going to go. So, what they decided is they're going to start making change in 1946. In 1946, management started being changed around a bit. Now, obviously, the Pennsylvania Railroad still wanted to have the best quality for their services. They wanted to provide the best service, the best work, and have satisfied customers, whether it'll be passengers or freight service for producers, manufacturers, and other types of businesses. So, this gets us near towards the end of the 1940s and starting the 1950s. Steam engines start being phased out a little bit faster. Instead of the mid to late 1950s, it started to be the early 1950s. The Pennsylvania needed to start doing swap outs and sells so they can buy more diesel power, whether it be Baldwin, Lima, Alco, or EMD. Currently on my railroad, going off track of this history, I don't have too many diesels, but I have a good amount of diesels, spreading from a vast, not really too much vast, but a good expansion from the late 1940s to early 2000s. You might be wondering how we're going to get to that point with the Pennsylvania. We'll get there in time. So, as time goes on, the Pennsylvania decided they wanted to keep their equipment, this is the conservative side of the company, for publicity reasons, and not only that, for historical reasons. Strasburg would have a few more engines than usual. In this universe, a couple of Q2s has survived, similar to how the big boys have survived. But during the Q2's development, during the late 1940s, a lot of work has come to notice that they're going towards the end of steam, so the Pennsylvania figured, why don't we try to make the best freight steam engine possible? Working with Baldwin, they had come up with a couple of upgrades to lower the maintenance costs of the Q2s. Granted, 2 locomotives under the boilers, such as articulateds, tend to be a little bit more maintenance heavy compared to the single locomotives that the Pennsylvania is usually used to riding on their railroad. So, engines like the duplexes had to be revamped and upgraded a bit. A lot of the T1s would be converted to Poppet Type B valves, and they figured that they performed somewhat better than the original Poppet Type A valve gear. Obviously, E6 number 460, as you see running on the layout, this is not the layout, this is a temporary layout, everybody, don't worry. In time, you will start seeing bench work. Not this year, but next year. 460 survived and would be continuing in operation until modern day. She will be sporting her 1927 scheme as she did during her famous Lindenberg run, pulling the movie all the way to, you know the story. So, she'll be still in the operation, and she'll be used on the Strasburg Railroad as well for operation. So, now we're moving towards the 50s. Again, a lot of steam engines are starting to be chosen for preservation for historical reasons, but steam is being phased out. This is where the Pennsylvania is starting to look at their competitors from the New York Central and starting to copy a little bit of what they're doing because they see the success that the New York Central had. So, railroad terms such as Broadway were starting to fade away. Certain areas of Pennsylvania did keep a Broadway, notably the Northeast Corridor and a couple other regions. So, the railroad realized if they come up with this new computer system that the New York Central was also developing at the time, they can reduce the amount of tracks needed for operating trains. It came from 4 down to 2 with the more sophisticated designs. The train phone has been updated and is also being used in this kind of system as well. However, it was starting to become antiquated near the 60s. So in due fashion, the Pennsylvania started getting rid of some of the train phone equipment. However, some of the equipment on the railroad still retained the train phone antenna, especially on diesels and some of the cabooses. What this means is that the reason why they were being preserved is for historical reasons. Now, whether or not you agree in a historical sense, that's up to you. On my railroad, they try to maintain their equipment as well as they can in this alternate history. So, as steam is fade out before mid-1950s, obviously we already stated that a number of steam locomotives have been kept in preservation for specialty runs Like, for example, the Union Pacific had 3985 pull a couple of freight trains in the early 2000s, 1990s, and probably some other times as well from customers to see a steam engine pulling freight trains. This is also the same thing that happened on the Pennsylvania. Coal trains run by certain steam engines would be still pulled by steam engines by request of the coal companies or the coal mines and power plants and all that stuff. So you would see some steam engines running around from time to time pulling coal trains for the delight of executives of these particular companies. Some other freight trains, such as merchandise and boxcar or van car services, would also use some steam engines by request of certain customers going out of town from Pennsylvania. However, the diesels have taken their way as the primary mode of power on the Pennsylvania Railroad. A lot of electrical equipment was also preserved, the GG1s notably. It wasn't a while till asbestos was considered not safe, so the GG1s were still using their old, kind of hazardous technology inside of their prime movers and their power plants on the GG1s. A couple of box cab electrics to P5As were kept around for freight service on the Northeast Corridor and other electrified services. So you'll see a couple of those running around, sometimes in double head, and sometimes running around as single, pulling locals and other freights. A lot of the diesels on this railroad tend to be Baldwin. Some people wonder why, but in this alternate universe, Baldwin has also tried to catch up as well. Now, during the war, the FRA was not as overbearing as in real life. So they still allowed research and development, but you couldn't produce any. You can only produce prototypes and use for testing purposes, but you can't pretty much make any in mass production. So this gives Alco and Baldwin and maybe even Lima and Fairbanks Morris as well, that's another one, gives them the chance to finally tune their diesels to be not rushed into production or anything like that when it came to the war's end. So this kind of changes the landscape a little bit. However, it doesn't mean that companies can start fumbling later on and then fall out of history. Notably Baldwin and a couple other companies like Lima, Fairbanks, and even Alco. So there'll be a lot more Baldwins, there'll be a lot more Alcos, and there'll definitely be a good amount of Fairbanks Morris on this railroad during the 60s. Of course, there's a lot of Sharks, and there's also going to be a number of passenger units as well that are by Baldwin. For example, BP-20s have been upgraded to BP-3200s. The BP-3200s are basically two RF-16 class diesel locomotives that would be using their prime movers to replace the original prototype models that had only made like 1,000 horsepower. So now the new prime movers make these diesels a lot more powerful. These ginormous 6-axle diesels would be serving on trains such as the Broadway Limited, as they would have intended to be used as, and be used as other passenger services, as well as in the future, when they're being maintained and kept to the modern day, they'll be used as special excursion trains for certain Pennsylvania trains that have kept their antiquated equipment. So throughout the 50s, we see that dieselization has come over, but there's some steam engines still running around and some doing, some specialty services. So now we're going to move into the 60s. the merger era. Near the end of the 1960s, we all know what happened with the Penn Central. So how is Penn Central going to still exist? Well, it does still exist in this universe. However, Pennsylvania didn't fully merge. With some lobbying with the government, as well as some executives trying to pull some bribes, which, to better or worse, to those who like history or anything like that, some people might not think this is possible. However, Pennsylvania could possibly survive the merger. In order to survive merger, you have to give up railroads or lines that met in direct competition way too much with a certain railroad. You can have some line competition, but you can't have overly excessive competition with lines paralleling each other. That being the New York Central, the Pennsylvania had to give up some lines. Whether it be 50% or 25% or even 75% of those lines, they had to be given up and sold over for the merger of Penn Central. The reason why Penn Central became a name and the Pennsylvania would survive as a smaller company than before, this would give the Pennsylvania a chance to rebuild, regrow, and reprioritize where their customers are going to be in the future. In the 60s and coming to the 70s, there would be an oil crisis, just like it happened in real life. So Pennsylvania would still be known as a coal railroad, and will be doing a lot of coal operations, especially in the Blue Ridges down south. Pennsylvania started prioritizing where their business will be going down south, however maintaining the main panhandle into the west of Chicago and Ohio. However, a new panhandle would be created, therefore making a V shape. The new panhandle will be going down to Jacksonville, Florida. But this won't come until a little bit later. However, some part of the panhandle was starting to grow down to the northeast corner of Tennessee, where the Tri-Cities are. Tri-Cities were not as huge as they were back then. However, Pennsylvania did see potential with the coaling and logging for making furniture, powering power plants, and other sorts of facilities by going to the Blue Ridges east of Tennessee and into North Carolina. For a while, it wasn't a huge moneymaker, but it definitely kept the company in the black for a while. Breweries and other services around the area of Tennessee also helped for moving booze, liquor, beer up and down the Blue Ridges to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is not a railroad that is shy of mountain ranges. In some certain circumstances, they borrowed some of the track right away from the Virginian, Norfolk, and Western, and the Clinchfield railroads. So Pennsylvania made good competition with these three railroads in the region. However, the Virginian can also bring coal down the mountain and then transfer it to the Pennsylvania and take it back up north or down south to the Tri-Cities of Tennessee. This branch didn't really start until late 1950s, early 1960s. So not a lot of steam would be seen on this railroad, but only on occasion. However, back in the 1940s and early 1950s, some passenger trains out to Pennsylvania were allowed trackage rights to go to Tennessee, and some freight trains as well. Trains around the country would share trackage rights to send not only freight cars, but passenger trains all across the country. It was a lot more interconnected than a lot of people would think would be. So, as that would happen, in the 1960s, Pennsylvania would have to ride the wave for a while during the merger era. Norfolk Southern did exist, and they had to compete really hard with the Norfolk Southern for a while. Until the 1980s, where they would finally merge with the Atlantic Coastline Railroad. So, how do we get to that point? Well, we have to lose some producers of diesel locomotives. However, there will be like some parts maintenance and parts backup for a lot of the equipment that would soon become classics by the 70s and 80s. With some corporate agreement in Baldwin would soon fall away but become a smaller company than it was. They would no longer produce locomotives, but they would provide making power plants, stationary power plants, and generators, diesel generators, for the time to come. Small and large. However, they would never get back into the railroad business, unfortunately. Similar to how FM Erie built, or Fairbanks Morris, they would drop out of the locomotive market later on and only make power plants, small power plants, and marine power plants. Alco would stick around, but would be merged with GE as a company. Instead of falling out in its own ways, Alco would become part of GE. GE started fiddling around with their own technology and started making pretty much their own versions of Alco locomotives. Alco decided that because of management problems and some sort of, corporate executive issues and some of them being sharks and whatnot, they decided that in conjunction with what the U.S. government allows, to be merged as a company with GE. So the company become GE Alco, or Alco being dropped off later on in the 80s and the 90s. But you will see some Alco prime movers being still used and some certain other technology that Alco had. So a lot of these companies, instead of, just falling off because of failures in this universe, a lot of it was just corporate mismanagement, which did actually happen in real life, especially for Alco when it came to South Africa when they were trying to produce some locomotives over there. They kind of messed up as well, and that therefore, in certain way, some shape or form, helped end Alco. So far, we're getting closer to merging with real life. However, the Pennsylvania still existed. Penn Central failed, and therefore New York Central failed as well, because of New Haven. It was always going to be New Haven. However, Penn Central did last a little bit longer than in real life in this universe. It lasted about close to 10 years until the 80s, and then Conrail formed. Amtrak still formed, and Penn Central dropped their passenger service, and Amtrak took over, right around the same time in real life. So Amtrak does exist in this universe. The Pennsylvania willingly gave up their passenger service as well, and therefore the Northeast Corridor, but did some freight on the Northeast Corridor still with some of their vintage equipment, and have upgraded their vintage equipment, notably the box cabs. The box cabs have been considerably overhauled to not have any asbestos or any poisonous or potentially dangerous chemicals inside their electric locomotives. And some of the GG1s were being converted away from those dangerous chemicals. Therefore, the company didn't have to research or design any new equipment entirely from the ground up, which saved some money, but did eat a bit of their budget away. So you would still see GG1s used even up to this day. GG1s would still be running. Not as many, but only a few. Same thing with the P5As. Although there'll be less P5As in the modern day, they would only be used for customer-requested special trains. The Pennsylvania was open to customer-requested specialty trains because of the region understanding the history of what the railroads have done. Of course, there were some companies that did not really care about vintage equipment and what the railroads have done for history, mainly because some of these people never grew up around railroads in the executive branch of these companies, nor did they give a thought about it, which is, for best or worse, it doesn't really matter. But you would still see some equipment running from time to time for excursions, publicity, and of course, for rail fans. So now we're in the 80s. We're getting close to the actual start of the history of the Pennsylvania Atlantic Railroad. Before we get to the Pennsylvania Atlantic Railroad's merge, we're going to talk about the Atlantic Railroad. The Atlantic East Coast, or Atlantic Coastline, to be more accurate actually and correct, the Atlantic Coastline was starting to lose business over the years. They were fairly successful, though with Norfolk Southern and other mergers coming around, and started to become a concern. The Pennsylvania saw an opportunity, an economic opportunity, of getting down to Florida. Florida, as we know today, has rapidly boomed in the past 20 years. Even then, as far back as since the 80s, with the ideas of the movies such as Miami Vice and all the other types of dramas and movies in history. Florida was pretty much the new California. So Pennsylvania wanted a piece of the pie of the growth down in the South. And what better way to do it than to merge with the Atlantic Railroad? So you would see Atlantic Railroad equipment running around from time to time, and some heritage equipment such as the E units that are in their original purple, white, and gold or black color. And they would run around pulling some specialty Atlantic Coastline trains as well. There would also be some heritage units that the Pennsylvania Atlantic Railroad would have running around with the Atlantic Coastline paint scheme and the Pennsylvania Railroad paint scheme. During this time, Norfolk Southern also made a Pennsylvania Railroad heritage locomotive as well, because some of the lines were given to eventually Norfolk Southern over time. So there's like a mix mash of like heritage units that other railroads had at the time. So now that the Pennsylvania Railroad merged with the Atlantic Railroad in the late 80s, of course there was only GE and END at the time being the producers of locomotives. What would happen is Pennsylvania realized that, yes, we do have this reach down to Florida, which is Jacksonville, Florida, which the Atlantic Coastline got down to. They got to meet a really nice port over there. In Jacksonville, Florida, the Pennsylvania kind of struck gold with an auto industry, the Ford Motor Company, having an auto manufacturing plant that would still operate until the 1990s, early 2000s. A motor car company. So Autorax would be used in the 90s up until 2000s, where the motor plant would be converted to a Toyota motor plant. The Toyota company bought the motor plant, and although in real life in Jacksonville, the Ford Motor Company's manufacturing plant was abandoned for a long time, in this universe, that company still existed. Therefore, brought a lot of jobs and people down to Florida more. A lot of passenger service by Amtrak would serve between the Tri-Cities of Northeast Tennessee and Pennsylvania itself. notably the Northeast Corridor. In this universe, the Silver Star would make a detour. Not every Silver Star, but some of the Silver Stars would make a detour to the west, notably in Florida when they go to Tampa Bay. In this universe, the Silver Star makes another detour to the Tri-Cities and then heads down to Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia, and then meet back where the Silver Meteor will go on the East Coast near Savannah down to Jacksonville. So, when the Pennsylvania would run their Heritage Fleet trains, they would run the train from Philadelphia, steam or diesel powered, go down to Washington, D.C., kind of separate from there, go through Virginia, go down the southern border of the Virginia to the Tri-Cities, and then it would go down from there into Atlanta. Then it would go from Atlanta and travel all the way through Georgia into Savannah, and then from Savannah, go all the way down to Jacksonville. It's a large detour. And the service was on and off during the transition era, but in the 60s to the 80s and 90s. After the 90s and early 2000s, Florida has become big enough, and the Tri-Cities have become a bustling boom for ethanol production, chemicals, and other types of chemical production. So you would see a lot of tank trains in the Tennessee era. So in the Tri-City areas, there's still some coal mining for some power plants, and the coal mine is still running. It's still running during this time. So you would still see some steam excursions and customer requests from the coal mine to deliver coal to power plants in Tennessee and to Pennsylvania. Norfolk Southern is not, and CSX were not as big as they are in real life today, mainly because of the Pennsylvania still existing. However, those railroads still exist in this universe. So let's say anybody wants to come over and bring some Norfolk Southern equipment or CSX equipment, it wouldn't be historically, violating this railroad's history or this fictional railroad's history. Trackage rights were still allowed, and power share was allowed as well. So, we're getting to the 90s. In the 90s, we still have GE equipment. We still have EMD equipment. However, the railroad started preferring more GE equipment than EMD. And EMD became more of like for switchers and stuff rather than locomotives. This makes GE a little bit more stronger as a company in this history, as in real life, a lot of railroaders do not really like GE equipment for notable reasons that I can't 100% really explain, but I'm pretty sure if you talk to anybody who works for the railroads, and whether it be engineers, conductors, or anybody of the sort, even maintenance people, there's a distaste for GE, which probably because of maintenance issues and quality issues for those locomotives. However, in this universe, GE is more on top of the ball. However, since there's like a reduction of competition, quality in the coming years will be kind of questionable. Not too questionable, but definitely questionable. You still have flukes like the SD45, the SD50 from GE, or not from GE, I'm sorry, EMD. And then you also have some of the other flukes from other companies, like from GE, the U25s, and certain other locomotives as well. With that, we're going to conclude from here, and then we're going to get to the 1990s and early 2000s further in. Okay, so we're in the 1990s. There isn't a third locomotive manufacturer entering the market. Baldwin's still producing prime movers, however, they've gotten more business in the ship prime movers and other markets as well. Baldwin going into more home generation with with power generation. Baldwin has certainly kind of fallen in the railroad sense from what they used to be over 100 years ago. So, in this era, spare parts are still being made for the Baldwin locomotives. You're not going to see as many Sharks or like Sharks, Erie Belts, other Fairbanks Morris products, and other older Alcos running as much during this era. There's still, whatever's left is still being kept in good condition, and other locomotives have been sold off to other companies across the country. Santa Fe bought some Baldwin Sharks in this universe, and they still run to this day in this universe. So, as there's a reduction of older equipment, there's newer equipment around. B40s, GE B40s, or dash Bs, if I'm getting that right. They're running around. They all have the Brunswick green color. All freight locomotives on this road are Brunswick green. They only have the PRR logo on them. And of course, their number board number. This will stick for a long time after it started coming around during the 70s or late 60s. So this will never change for a long time. This is for simplicity reasons, lower maintenance. And that keystone is really just all you need to tell the whole story about the Pennsylvania on those locomotives. Also, personally, I don't want to do the 5-stripe stuff on the modern diesels or anything like that. They're a little bit complicated in the design and shape to do something like that. They're not as easy as like an E unit or like a GG1 to put stripes on. So I'm going to go with the real life reason of just paint maintenance and keeping the cost down of painting. Until, like, some model company makes, more Pennsylvania modern fantasy stuff, I'll buy some and say, hey, these are, fantasy schemes. Well, not really fantasy schemes, but they were more so like heritage kind of schemes of back then. Probably for passenger excursion usage. So, yeah, eventually we get into early 2000s. Amtrak's still running. The Silver Star service is still running for the Tri-Series area. There's a lot of P-42s during this time. A lot of Amtrak equipment is still current. P-42s were a lot more reliable than they were in real life. I don't know how much more reliable they would be, but Amtrak used them for a reason. They really liked them. And in this universe, they really, really liked them. So, eventually I'll get some P-42 DCs, which I have pre-ordered from Train World. They are DCC ready, so they will be getting the TCS WOW treatment. We all know about that. So they'll be doing some small Amtrak services that will be sprung up during this period. For services that don't go all the way to Florida, like the Silver Star, which I do have the complete passenger train set for. So eventually I'll get some more AM fleets, not too many. They're going to probably be 5-car, 4-car sets for, short line service for Tennessee and Pennsylvania. Not too long or anything like that. They don't necessarily need sleepers or anything like that. And they're for pretty much cheap service to go to Philadelphia. I'm not sure where exactly, like, the region that Pennsylvania will be, the Pennsylvania region on the railroad will be. It's probably going to be southern Philadelphia or something like that, South Philadelphia. And I'll try to recreate the on the wall around the Pennsylvania area where Philadelphia is like way in the background. like Maine, Center Philadelphia. So it'll be Southern Philadelphia, and it'll be more like a triad of services with steam, diesel, and electrics in the area. During the 60s and 70s, and more so towards the 80s, electrical catenary service was brought down to Tennessee, in the Tri-Cities area. In the modern days, though, you don't see a lot of locomotives using that service. And the reason why is because not a lot of electrics were running around in the modern day. I would love to get a freight version of the ACS 64 Siemens locomotive, but nobody makes a fantasy model of a freight version. Which would be kind of cool to get one, because a geared down, freight version or freight geared ACS 64 would be kind of cool in real life, but they don't exist, so most of the work would be diesel locomotives doing the freight work. Right now I have 4 ES44s, unpainted on deck by Walthers. It's the mainline ES44s, so those will eventually be painted Brunswick green, and they'll have Pennsylvania Railroad decals put on them. And they'll get custom numbers for them as well. So that goes into the history of the early 2000s with locomotives there. I'm not sure about SD70s, the Aces. I'll have to think about that. I have to find Undex for a good value, DCC ready as well. And I'll probably get 4 of those as well for just a mix of, locomotives running around. Will there be auto racks? For auto racks, they would come between the Florida and Georgia area, and also probably up to Tennessee. Maybe not Pennsylvania, but there's always a possibility that they could also go to Pennsylvania from the Jacksonville auto plant in the Jacksonville area on the lower level. So auto racks would still be used for a certain amount of time, but eventually they would get phased out. Probably because of a local, car manufacturing in Pennsylvania would take over. So auto racks would probably be only seen going to Tennessee, and that's it. Possibly. It depends. I haven't really thought about that much when it comes to auto racks. How about intermodals? There might be some intermodal service, although I don't really see a lot of intermodals around here. It's mostly just tank trains and all that stuff, ethanol trains. And I haven't seen really any coal trains, but there's some grain service around here as well with some covered hoppers. So there'll probably be a lot more covered hoppers, tank cars, and probably still coal trains running around in the Tennessee area and Pennsylvania area, in between those areas. Not so much. Well, the tank trains will probably come down to Florida, now that I think more about it. So this is where we get into the what if area of what hasn't really been thought out in the 2010s and so on. Of course, Amtrak is still around. Pennsylvania is still going strong, as is the Big Five today. However, the business route of how Pennsylvania runs is that there's no PSR on the Pennsylvania Railroad in this universe. There is no PSR. There's none of this ESG, BS, or anything like that. It's a company that's still technically, in this era, run conservatively, but they're still open to new ideas. However, they don't believe in hiring people based off of whoever they are. It's based off of if you're a hard worker and you're a quality worker. That's what the Pennsylvania still would strive for, I would hope. But in my universe, that's what they strive for on this railroad. You're pretty much a worker who strives to do the best that they can in the utmost quality that you can provide. Basically, you're hired to do the job, and you can prove that you can do the job. Not someone who's hired just for numbers' sake or anything like that, and you don't have quality or experience behind your name. You have to be a worker who is willing to do the best And that's pretty much the conservative side of the company. They want to conserve quality, and they want to conserve the best people who are qualified for the job, which every company should do, but this is what my railroad would do. So there's no PSR. Trains are still run similar to how they were run in the older days. Cabooses, unfortunately, were phased out just around the same time in real life. So, pretty much around the 80s or so. But you will see some cabooses sometimes with those FRED devices at the end in case the conductor has to ride at the back of the train. So some cabooses were still used. There's a number of N5 and N8 cabooses still running around. And a lot of them are still hauled in the heritage fleet. So, we're pretty much wrapping up with the end of the history of the Pennsylvania Atlantic Coastline Railroad. Pretty much Pennsylvania Atlantic Railroad. A lot of equipment share. And in the modern days, it's kind of easier to predict what's going on. Maybe not entirely. The toughest part to make the Pennsylvania exist in this fictional universe was during the transition era. And they had to downsize quite a bit. And they had to really pretty much turn into like money-saving mode. And with that money-saving, they had to get rid of a couple of Broadways. So there is a Broadway, sort of, coming from Pennsylvania to the Tri-Cities of Tennessee. But that's because I wanted to keep everything double-tracked. And the double track pretty much comes back around and loops around the islands, or the peninsulas, not really islands, the peninsulas of each region for the Tennessee and Pennsylvania regions. So, in a way, it becomes a Broadway. So since it became a Broadway, sometimes the lines are still used. It's a major vein, pretty much, straight out. So when we go leave the Tennessee era and start going down to Helix, right around in that region that we're pointing at right now on screen, the Helix will be there, and I will go to the Georgia era, which will be below. It doesn't really loop anywhere, the Georgia area. It's pretty much a dead end to the corner of this room over here. And it loops around, pretty much right around here where the swing bridge will be to go across to go access the Helix. But you will go around here, and you would be in the Florida area down here. And Jacksonville would terminate over here with the terminal. And right in the center right here would be the car facility. And there'll be some cattle export. There'll be like a meat packaging plant. So cattle from Georgia would come down into Jacksonville, and it would come here, and there will be the icer, the ice blocks will be around here too. You can still do this kind of stuff modern day. Ice houses don't really, as far as I know, exist anymore. Correct me if I'm wrong. I haven't seen anything like that, but we'll just say they exist because this is pretty much a multi-era railroad. Similar to my club's layout back down in Florida. It's a multi-era railroad from the 50s to modern day. Mainly 1970s, 80s, 90s kind of railroad. But they allow all eras. So same with here. I allow mainly all eras. Post-war steam. There could be some Clinchfield steam engines running around. Norfolk and Western would run around, especially in the Tennessee area. So there is definitely a good amount of trains you would see running around from different eras around here on this layout once it's built. It's going to take a while. I'm going to wrap up this video saying it's going to take a while to make this layout. I hope you guys enjoyed the history, and if you liked to add on to the history, you can. If you have some criticisms about the history to make it more plausible, please let me know. I'm looking to add more stuff to how the history was about. How I came up with the history of the Pennsylvania, I talked with a former member of my club, who knew a lot about railroad history. And he told me that, what I was telling him so far can be quite plausible. How plausible, we'll never know. Maybe in an alternative universe. But, well, in real life there was an alternative universe. But he says it's a good start. And the history could always change around on what operates once we get more obscure with the 1980s, 1970s, 1960s, 90s era. But the history of the Pennsylvania Atlantic Railroad, while it did start around the 80s officially, it really started right after World War II. And it's all mainly because of those EMD units, the E7s, arriving in December at the same time the T1s arrived. It was a signature of what's next for the railroad. Is the railroad going to go more into a more progressive, new ideas kind of way with the electric, with the diesels and all this stuff, and no more steam engines? In real life, it was still pretty much half and half, mainly for passenger service and eventually more freight service. But the Pennsylvania did something different, and they did more rapid for diesels and like the freight service and passenger service, and which led to more cost-saving measures for other reasons besides motive power and design. So with that being said, this is the end of the history of the Pennsylvania Atlantic Railroad session. It's still going to grow. Amtrak is still coming up with new things in real life, so whatever happens in real life with Amtrak you would see on the Pennsylvania Atlantic Railroad in the future. So, in terms of other railroad equipment, I'm not sure. We'll have to see what happens with the freight side, because the Pennsylvania would mainly do freight, as with other major railroads in real life. However, they would have other equipment for other special occasions. And just like the UP, they have special excursion runs with their steam engines. The Pennsylvania does their special excursion runs with their steam engines. The Pennsylvania really, truly is pretty much the Union Pacific of the East Coast. It's very popular. One of the most well-known railroads on the U.S. continent. It truly is a spectacular railroad. And I'm glad to come up with a special idea of what if Pennsylvania came to modern day? And in the future, I hope to show you my, custom projects with the modern locomotives and the Brunswick green with the Pennsylvania logos on them. It'll be really interesting. So without further ado, this video now concludes. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys in the next video. This is Pensy Joe signing out, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye now.
By the shore, hear the mighty rush of the engine, hear the lonesome hobo squall, riding through the jungle on the Wabash Cannonball. Now here's to Daddy Claxton, may his name forever stand, and may he be remembered in the courts throughout the land. When his earthly race is over, let the curtains round him fall. We'll carry him home to victory on the Wabash Cannonball. Oh, listen to the jingle, the rumble, and the roar, as she glides along the woodland to the hill and by the shore. Hear the mighty rush of the engine, hear the lonesome hobo squall, riding through the jungle on the Wabash Cannonball.